Hi there, today on Typical Books we're going to be talking about Slewfoot by Brom. Now this is a witchy little tale based in 1666. It stars our darling Abitha, who is featured on the cover with hooves. So right away I wanted to love this book. And I did. I liked it a lot. I wouldn't say loved. It's not 5 stars plus, but it's really close. We'll get into why the stars fade in a minute. Brom, or Gerald Brom, is an artist that many people are very familiar with. I'm not so much familiar with him, although he did do a lot of the art for Diablo 2 and 3, which is fantastic. And most of my favorite art for Diablo is done by Brom. I never played Magic the Gathering, and that's where, from what I understand, where the larger amount of people became very interested in his work. He's the author of something like 26 novels or books. He has a lot of art books and novels, and I want to pick up his Krampus the Yule Lord book to go along with all my Krampus love. Now, Slewfoot, A Tale of Bewitchery. I really enjoyed where this went. It brings us to Connecticut, and if you've watched John at Books and Blood tour across America, he's mentioned this in the Connecticut video, and I really like this place. Although I will say I felt sort of off the map in this. I didn't have a good idea spatially where the village and Abitha's homestead was, and the layout of those things. Everything was a little murky, and there's a lot of murkiness in this that really works well, but that one I wanted a little more of my feet planted on the ground in that soil, and I didn't really get it for whatever reason, and I'm not sure if that is a downfall of mine needing more spatial waymarkers or something. But the countryside is described in great detail. So I've never been to Connecticut. I haven't been to much of New England, but I have an idea that it's a little bit like Northern Ontario here and there, and especially the farmland. This is a Puritan settlement, and it reminds me a lot of Mennonite or the Pennsylvania Dutch settlements or Amish settlements. Very similar, although with a lot more forgiveness. And Abitha, being a displaced girl from Ireland who has been married into this Puritan village by this Puritan man, is completely a fish out of water. And I enjoy that because she does have some cunning ways. She's a herbalist and she's a bit of a healer. I wouldn't go so far as to say she's a witch, but that's what was taken as a witch at that time, as we well know. I really liked her transformation from sort of a bit of an upstart and this secret herbalist to a feuding landowner, and that I think is such a cool stretch. And some people might fault that as it is too much of a stretch perhaps for some, but there were many women, I'm sure, in this exact position at this time. In my written review, I liken this to a mix of A Midsummer's Night Dream and Robert Eggers' film The Witch, and I think that that's the best marriage I can think of to describe what you'd be reading. An ancient spirit awakens in a dark wood. The wild folk call him father, slayer, protector. The colonists call him Slewfoot, demon, devil. I've read this before. To Abitha, recently widowed, outcast, alone and vulnerable in her pious village, he is the only one she can turn to for help. Together they ignite a battle between pagan and Puritan, one that threatens to destroy the entire village, leaving nothing but ashes and bloodshed in its wake. I really like that angle as well, the pagan versus Puritan in a way, because she is this wise woman who is up against some very staunch Puritan, and the whole village isn't completely brainwashed either, as we come to know. There are people in the village that are on her side. There have been people in this village for years who have relied on Abitha for her healing arts, and I really like how many of them can band with her to the best of their abilities, and a lot of them are pulled toward the vox populi and following what the church and what the fathers of the church have to say. Although some people very high up in the church are more on Abitha's side than it would seem. Her relationship with her husband is wonderful, and even though he dies very, very soon within the book, we do get glimpses of their relationship throughout, and I really like that. Hearing of like a deceased family member is what it felt like, and hearing tales of like grandfathers you never met. And that's what it felt like when you're hearing back some of these recollections and stories of her husband, and I loved those scenes very much. Other scenes I liked were those conspiring against Abitha and not necessarily the townsfolk, who all felt a little drab. And there's where some stars fade. Aside from me not feeling spatially grounded within this book, a lot of the people are very samey, very drab, very gray. Now you could argue, well, they're Puritans in 1666, Lydia. They're not going to be very pizzazz-filled people. But no, they're just a little samey. A lot of the dialogue without tags could have been misplaced or mixed up from character to character. I don't have an idea of what anyone in this book looks like, save those that have been illustrated and a few descriptors of Abitha. Now I don't want like a mirror scene, somebody describing what they look like or describing everyone around them, because that's creepy and weird. But I just could not picture these people, and a lot of them just looked very samey, you know, drab, gray, country, farmer, Puritan, male. Even some of the standout characters, there is one person in the town who is the first to accuse anyone of witchcraft and deviltry. He actually goes out on a regular basis looking for the devil in the forest, and we meet him very early on, and he's almost like a comic relief throughout. Very dark, sort of like Worm Tongue or something. He's a very, very dark person, but he's funny. But I can't picture what he looked like, and I felt sort of like at a loose ends with a lot of those characters. Not that I couldn't tell them apart, because it is written expertly, but I wanted a little bit more of a visual to accompany what I was reading. Speaking of visuals to accompany what I'm reading, this book is a typical book in that it has a spine and a front cover and a back cover. We are blessed with some frontispieces for each chapter that are very fitting and just nice. And then we get to the illustrations, of which I will skip one at least, because I found it spoilery. While I was reading it, I sort of glanced. I was looking at the titles of the images before really taking in the full image, and I saw the last image in this set that's in the center of the book, and I skipped it. But suffice that to say, we have Abitha, who is also featured on the cover, and this is what rings true while you're reading it, the way that she is described and the way she describes herself in the scant bits that she does. And then we get to meet some of the other people involved, like Samson and Slewfoot and the wild folk. Forest is an enchanting little thing. All these creatures have child's faces. Creek is the creepiest one, and what's funny is right before reading this, I'd had a dream that my fish, when I used to have cichlids, African cichlids, that they were flying around in the sky, and this is sort of how Creek gets around. Sky is gorgeous in this picture, but I didn't think that Sky looked like this from the description, so I'm very glad that there are these images to go along, especially for the wee folk, these wild folk. Samson was very well described. He reminds me of the Green Man. He's a mix between Baphomet and the Green Man. Gorgeous illustrations. Momenophet is described here and there, and I'm glad that this exists. Slewfoot as a myth is described by the townsfolk more than anybody else, and this is pretty much the shadowy horned figure that we have described, especially by the guy who goes hunting the devil. This is what he describes that he sees, and what other people in the village describe as the mythical Slewfoot, because this myth is living alongside these other characters. Samson that emerges from the forest, these little folk that come along with him as sort of counterparts. They're somewhat described in these mythologies, and they have their own set of mythologies that are sort of interwoven with what's actually going on in the townspeople's lives. The bigger thing going on in the townspeople's lives is Edward, Abitha's husband, has died, leaving his land in her name. And that just cannot happen, especially when Wallace, his brother, has taken over the deed and sold the land to somebody else to pay off his own debts, thinking it would automatically be his as the living heir in the male sense to his father's land. Now his father, who would have been Abitha's father-in-law, had left the land to Edward. Even though Edward is dead, it is now Abitha's land, quite legally, and she has to fight for land of her own. So in order to do this, she needs to pay off Wallace's debts so he'll just leave her alone. But you can commiserate with Abitha in that she just wants this settled and wants her land and to be left alone and to practice her healing arts the way that she always had, even if it's in secret, because she doesn't want to rock the boat. Everyone is making this unbelievably difficult. Because she has to work this land all by herself, she comes up with some ingenious tactics to do so, and the parish, for one, gives her some time away from church, which is usually not granted to people. And everyone gets really suspicious because she gets some time away from church. I mean, wouldn't we all like time away from church if we were forced to go there? Yes, please. So with the fantasy elements that are intriguing and beautiful and have a mythology and a story and a goal all of their own, there is this other story going on with the land and the church, which could be boring if it was in less skilled hands, but it was intriguing, and I really love this. I would love to see this as a film. I'm going to definitely pick up other Brom books, and I think this is really unique in what makes it an atypical book, is it's being illustrated by the author. We can't do all the things, right? So not many authors illustrate their own books. And I mean, if you told me that Brom cut down the trees and ground the pulp to make this book himself, I would believe you. And the story, which is wonderful. It was a little twee in points for me because I'm not a fantasy fan, but it was grounded enough in real world and quasi-historical fiction, and of course horror, because it is gory. There are some really brutal scenes. There's some very brutal things that happen to people, let alone what happens to women in this. Some things that happen in the very beginning of the book are quite dark and quite sad, to do with death and animals, dismemberment, gore, eviscerations, all of those sorts of things. And it doesn't really let up, although it's not a constant gore fest. Not every single chapter ends with a set piece of blood and destruction. It does have enough of it, though, to definitely keep my interest as a bit of a gore hound. Yet it is a fantasy story first and foremost, although it is not steeped in fantasy to the point where it is only a fantasy novel for fantasy fans. So I think it's a really good choice if you're looking to branch out and get into maybe some more fantastical writing, or you like fantasy quite a bit and horror and want to see a good marriage of the two. So that's it for a short, sweet review of Slewfoot by Brom. If you've read it, which a lot of us have, let me know in the comments. And if this sounds interesting to you and you're going to add it to your reading list, let me know. Thank you for watching, and have an ooky, spooky day.